Lonely Dragon Needs a Mate. Book 1 in the Dragon Smugglers in Space series. Written by Marcy Jacks. Published by Siren Publishing. Read aloud for you by Sebastian Green. Chapter 1. The instant Axel Rogan laid eyes on the 20 or so travellers, he knew something was up. Aside from his ever-interested erection, that is. But damn, he could usually control himself. That came with the territory of being captain. "We don't transport people," Axel said. Beside him, Ammond and Halvard put their hands on their blades. A clear warning for these people not to push it. But Axel didn't think it would come down to that. He didn't want it to come down to that either. He was curious. He wanted to know more about these people, especially the cute one in the middle, the one talking and trying to negotiate with the group. "We can pay you," he insisted, eyes the colour of chestnuts, only they blazed defiantly like a star. A dying star, getting ready to let out one last burst of light before it went out forever. People didn't wear cloaks with hoods because they were regular citizens. They did it to hide their faces. Usually this implied criminal behaviour, and the cute one in the middle was sounding more and more desperate with each word he spoke. "How much money do you have? We only take physical gold or credit coins, untraceable." We have gold," the man in the middle said. Axel watched him with interest as he waved to his men, calling some of them forward as they opened the satchels they carried. All of it contained what appeared to be the riches of a fine house. Gold and silver saucers, goblets, pitchers, even a few candelabras. Ammon snorted, pulling his dagger. "These men are thieves. Let's kill them." The vast majority of the cloaked men tensed, or shifted uncomfortably at these words. Some looked ready to run. Skittish they were. That was usually a side effect of being a thief. Not all were confident, romantic rogues, like in the storybooks. Everyone reacted like this, except for the man in the middle, with those intense eyes. He stared Axel right in the eyes, defiance in them, determination and anger. "If you won't give us a ride, we'll find another ship." Axel hooked his fingers into his belt. He was enjoying this too much. "Why should I let you leave? You just said it yourself, we're smugglers. The fact you know that information is enough to put you out of your misery." Ammond, taking that as the permission he needed to step forward and take out the targets, made it 2 steps before Axel grabbed for the man's shoulder. "Not yet, friend. I want to know what he has to say to this." Axel barely took his eyes off the man in front of him. "Your turn. What do you have to say to this?" God, he was handsome when he glared like that. Handsome without being rough and hard around the edges like the men that Axel commanded. And Axel found himself wondering what he looked like beneath that robe. "Did you see all those goods?" Axel asked, when the man said nothing. "You're a smuggler. What does it matter where I got them?" "Good point. So, you have stolen the goods. Nowhere near enough to bring 2 or 3 of you, let alone all of you. You're obviously on the run from the authorities on this shark-infested shithole. Why should I take you again?" Axel asked, even though he'd already made up his mind for the most part. He wanted this man. He couldn't explain why, but had it not been for his body armour, there was a better than even chance his cock stand would be showing at this moment. He was a dragon, an alpha. He needed to act like it. We can... The man didn't seem to have any words, as if he was stuck. Axel's pulse quickened, his blood warming in his veins far beyond what it should have done for a cold-blooded creature like himself. Halvard spoke up. "Axel, I don't mean to question you at a time like this, but we've been here for longer than we're supposed to be." Axel sighed. That was true. This was one of the few planets where sharks and dragons could trade goods, or smuggle them, without fear of being shot on sight. But that didn't mean relationships were easy. Their docking pass was likely expired. They had to get off Raxol before a bunch of sharks came over with heavy fines and booted them off-world. And now the cute leader of the strange group seemed to be having some sort of panicked group talk. Probably trying to figure out what they were going to do if this didn't turn out the way they wanted. and the best directions to run in. "Tell you what," Axel said, catching the attention of the cute one in the middle. "I'll take you to Earth if that's what you want." It is what I want," the young man said quickly. "All of them, too, though." Axel nodded. Sure, but you and your team are going to have to do some things for me and my crew." "What are you doing?" Ammon muttered under his breath. Axel grinned at his friend. "You always said you wanted to have someone to come in and clean up after you. Now you can have that." What? The young man asked. Axel smiled at him. "We need servants, and Thorvald needs help in the kitchens. Anyone who rides with us won't be sitting back and doing nothing. The decks will be scrubbed, mess hall cleaned up after meals, and the shower rooms need to be taken care of. You." Axel pointed at the young man, still smiling as this idea really started to take fruit, and it was such a good idea. "You are going to be my personal servant." The young man glared at him. "Slaves?" Axel cocked his head to the side a little. "Kinda strange that you would hear work was involved and somehow immediately equate it to be slavery. But no, this will be your proper payment. You didn't think that little sack of stolen goods was going to be enough to bring all of you, did you?" Colour flooded the other man's cheeks. Fuck, he was too good looking. What was with this strange pull Axel was feeling? "We accept the offer. Thank you." Axel blinked. Shocking. He'd expected a touch more fight, a little more banter, but it appeared as if this man was simply going to give up, just like that. He'd actually been hoping for a little more of a challenge. That would have been fun. Oh well, Halvard was right, there was no time for it. Axel clapped his hands together. "Good, we leave right away, so you'd better not have any more shit we need to carry, or luggage, 'cause we're not taking it." "We don't have any." Maybe they were escaped prisoners. Axel felt a quick instant of hesitation, but one look into those eyes, that face, and how could Axel say no? "Come with me," Axel said, holding his hand out to the man in the front. He hesitated, but eventually stepped forward, taking what was offered. His touch sizzled all the way up Axel's arm. Pleasure and desire the likes of which Axel had never before experienced in his life flooded him. It was such a shock that he was momentarily lost for breath. "Axel, you alright?" Halvard asked. Axel couldn't look away from the man. He couldn't. "What's your name?" The man appeared as nervous as a mouse in the claws of a cat. "Thomas." Axel nodded. "Nice name." He heard the man's heartbeat quicken. Thomas was feeling this too. It was making him nervous. "You a human? Or a shifter?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Human. Some of my friends are shifters, though. Is that a problem?" Not that any of the others were shifters. Axel couldn't give a damn. The only thing he cared about was that the man standing before him wouldn't have any proper instincts towards what was happening to them. Axel would have to ease him into it. But how in the hell was he going to do something like that? The very idea of being gentle, when Axel almost never was, made him panic slightly. He would work through it. He had to get Thomas into his ship and settled in Axel's quarters. Are you okay?" Thomas asked, evidently taking it as worrisome when Axel didn't answer him. Axel nodded and smiled, curling his arm around the shoulder of his mate. "I am more than all right. Come, you must be thirsty. It's blisteringly hot out here." Chapter 2. Thomas didn't understand it, but he definitely felt that something was going on. He felt it in his hand when the captain, Axel Rogan, the legendary smuggler, took him by the hand and asked his name. Something ignited when the blonde-haired captain spoke to him and touched him like that. Like a sudden shock of pleasurable electricity that made him stand up straighter and just be aware of absolutely everything about that other man. Thomas had tried to ignore the heat, the spark inside him, when he first started talking and negotiating to get the ride to Earth. He figured it was just because Axel was a handsome man, and he had a nice smile with white teeth. He almost looked like he could be a master, but he wasn't. He worked outside the law, instead of within the laws that enslaved people. Now Thomas was walking beside Axel, with Axel's arms around his shoulders, walking up the ramp that, according to Axel, led to the back of the ship where the storage was kept. Thomas needed to be paying attention to these things, but he could hardly get his ears to work, his brain to properly function, anything. He felt like he was walking in a dream, a daze. It wasn't just the shock that he'd actually done it and gotten 20 whole people here, or the shame for the ones he'd had to leave behind. Axel could be talking about his secret, evil plans for taking Thomas and the men he'd come here with into the furnace area and just killing them all. That was how much Thomas wasn't paying attention. He didn't seem to snap out of it until he realised that he was being led away from his friends, from Ryan, from Tanner, Fenris and everyone else. Those big, scary alphas, one of whom had wanted to kill him, were being left behind with the others, and they were huddled together, clearly scared out of their minds. Thomas started dragging his feet. "Wait a minute, what's happening? Aren't they coming with us?" Axel laughed, but it was a happy sound, and not something that could have been sinister and scary. "You really weren't paying attention. Don't worry, I'm having a hard time focusing too." "But where are we going, and why are they staying in storage?" Thomas looked back at his friends as he and Axel turned down a long grey metal hallway that had more metal wires and thick tubes in the ceiling. "They have to stay somewhere," Axel said, as if it should have been obvious. Maybe it should, because Axel looked at him, seemed to see the panic that was still in Thomas's eyes, and he continued. "We don't have spare rooms. Our ship is large, but every space is used for something. Our crew take up whatever space is available. Half of them are sharing rooms." "But the ship is so big," Thomas said, hardly able to understand. Even when he'd been a slave, Thomas had a space for himself. Of course, pleasure slaves were kept better maintained and cared for. This was mostly for the sake of their owners, but Thomas had always thought all free men could afford their own spaces, that they wouldn't have to share a room if they could help it. It seemed he'd been wrong. Thomas had been prepared to work if he could have been a free man. He just hadn't been aware that even free men had to make sacrifices with their things, and that they didn't always have things to sacrifice. It had been a shock to learn that as he'd spent the last 2 days on the streets, protected and hidden away by, of all people, the homeless drunks that the masters despised so much. "So then, if there are no spare spaces or rooms, where do you sleep?" "I have chambers to myself," Axel said. "They're small, to be sure, but they're private and comfortable. You'll stay there." Thomas tensed. Even as a pleasant shiver rippled up his spine, he couldn't stop himself from reacting. "I will?" He wasn't scared by the idea. He kind of liked the idea. No, not kind of. He really liked that idea, and he didn't know why he did, especially to this extent. "Not for anything terrible, don't worry." Axel smiled so handsomely. It was difficult to believe that this was the great smuggler that eluded the law and spat in the face of the elite. A legendary figure like that brought to mind someone much older, and maybe a little more plain in the face, possibly rough around the edges. This man looked like he could smooth talk his way in and out of everything, and Thomas realised what he'd agreed to when he said he'd be Axel's personal servant. Of course, everyone wanted sex. Everyone from the elites, the royal sharks, and even their snobby footmen, all the way down to the guards who protected the property their masters slept on. Before, Thomas could get out of these sorts of situations. He didn't have to give sex to anyone other than the masters who paid to keep him. He could even tell on the men who had tried to talk him into sex and have them punished. Here, he was completely at Axel's mercy. It was strange. Thomas had never felt a fear quite like it in his entire life. He was in a situation he didn't know how to handle or control, and he had no clue what to do to either get out of it or make it easier on himself. He was used to not being in control, but it was the anxiety he felt over it that was new. He wasn't scared, not really, but this was something else he didn't have the words for. Axel didn't let him go. Thomas kept his head up. He still felt the stirrings of something pleasant deep inside him, just below his belly and in his cock. But he also felt like he needed to pay attention to where he was and the faces around him. Everyone walked with a purpose, as if they knew where they were going and what they were doing. No one wore the black uniforms of the military, but they all certainly walked like the military. They also walked with pistols and knives at their sides. Thomas figured it makes sense. If the sharks walked with weapons, why wouldn't the dragon people? The lights became brighter, the walls and ceilings less dour and mechanical, but the floors and walls were still made up of metal, and at one point they turned down another long hallway, and at the end of it, Thomas saw the first set of windows. The cockpit. It was amazing. They weren't in flight yet, still docked, but Thomas realised in that moment that very soon he would see what Raxor looked like from high above. He would see the stars while he was flying within them. He would also see the Earth's sun, its planets and moons, and the Earth within a couple of weeks. Axel gripped Thomas's hand even tighter. He seemed to be hurrying, his step quick and light, eager. "My quarters are close to the flight deck for obvious reasons," Axel said, looking back at Thomas with a knowing smile. Thomas smiled. "Makes sense." Axel stopped at what looked like a wall, but he tapped it. Blue light appeared, and then a console of some sort opened up out of the wall, presenting him with a small screen. Axel pressed his palm to it, and then typed in some numbers before the wall split open once again. This time it was wider and tall enough to fit a couple of grown men. "This way," Axel said, as if Thomas had a choice as he was being dragged along like this. He was going to accept this. This was his payment. 50 people had tried to escape, and Thomas had only made it out with 20. If this is what it took for him to make it, to ensure the safety of the people he promised freedom to, then he would gladly do the work. "Give me 1 second, Axel said, squeezing Thomas's hand very briefly before he turned away from him. Axel had said his quarters weren't very large, but they were definitely 3 times the size of what Thomas had been used to when he'd been. He wasn't going to think about that anymore. That wasn't his life anymore. Still, he had to admit, this room, quarters, whatever it was called, was actually kind of nice. Thomas went to the walls while Axel spoke into an intercom to a man named Mikhail. There were toy models on the shelves, ship models. Thomas had seen the children of some prominent shark families play with toys such as this, but very rarely. These were the sort of toys that required a person to paint the pieces and put it all together, and the children of great families didn't have the patience for such things, for the most part. If they did have a finished model, it was likely because one of their servants had completed the projects for them, what with the way those children destroyed their toy ships. These were intricate, however, in all different shapes, and some bigger than others. It took a higher level of skill for anyone to be able to create models such as this, and in such fine detail as well. Even Thomas knew that. He hesitated briefly before reaching out and touching one. Very gently, he slid his finger over the pointed dip of what was the tiny cockpit on an ancient-looking spacecraft. The stand it was latched to must have been screwed down, or glued down, because it didn't move much when Thomas touched it. "You like 'em?" Thomas flinched, pulling away. Axel was right behind him. He hadn't noticed when the man had stopped talking and walked over to him. "They're very nice. You made 'em?" Axel nodded. "Yeah, it's a nice hobby to have. I like picking up a couple when I dock at planets that have good markets. You usually only find them on planets in the United Kingdom." Thomas was just fascinated that the captain of this ship, a smuggler, was interested in something as creative as this. "Is it true that the United Kingdom used to only be Earth?" "Far as I know. Before that it was a couple countries within Earth itself. Glad I didn't live back then." "Why?" Axel's eyes widened, and he burst out laughing. Are you kidding? Stranded on a single mud ball your whole life? Christ, they couldn't even get outside of their own solar system for the longest time. That's depressing as hell. Thomas smiled. You like flying through space? Space and air, the best possible ways of flying. But space is awesome. I'd never give it up. Thomas didn't understand that at all, but he'd never flown through space. He jumped slightly when he felt the rumble beneath him, and then he swayed slightly. What's happening? We're taking off, Axel said. I said we were leaving right away, remember? Oh, right. Thomas did remember that, and the rumble increased beneath his feet, until everything around him shook. This lasted for possibly 10 seconds or so before it stopped, however, and then it felt as though Thomas was standing back on solid ground. Then he sighed, not because that horrible noise from the engine had stopped, and not because the floor beneath him was no longer swaying. He sighed because this meant he'd really done it. He'd actually escaped. He'd gotten out of the palace, and now he was flying off-world. He was getting away. He was going to be free. They were all going to be free. He was a free man. Thank you so much, Thomas said. Axel reached out, his hand clasping tightly, comfortingly, to Thomas's shoulder. Of course. That sensation came over him again. Thomas still had his hood up, and it wasn't as though Axel was touching Thomas's skin to skin. But there was something about this, something about being touched like this by that man, that made him sit up and really take notice. He looked Axel in the eyes, and he couldn't figure out or place why he was so drawn to the man, why he suddenly felt too tight for his own skin. Axel pushed the hood off his head, revealing his hair and face better to the light. He wasn't sure why, but Thomas was suddenly tense when Axel did that. Not because he was scared, but he kind of felt shy. He didn't understand why. You are so beautiful. Oh, lots of people say that. I'm nothing like those people. Thomas looked up at Axel and realized there really was something different about the way he stared at Thomas compared to the way that the masters, his former masters, used to stare at him. There was lust in his eyes, to be sure, but something else, something different. Thomas couldn't explain it, but he liked it. Stranger still was how much he wanted it. What's happening? His heart raced 1,000 light years a minute. He could hardly catch his breath, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up straight when Axel touched his cheek and leaned in. Do you know what a mate is? Thomas wet his lips. Was Axel going to kiss him? Because he wouldn't mind if Axel kissed him. I think so. Tell me what it is. Thomas swallowed hard. It's when shifters form a bond. They put all their resources together, promise to protect each other and their families. They live together? What? Axel was shaking his head, and Thomas didn't understand. That's what people do when they want to have a mating on paper. That's a formal union. I guess you could call it that. A mating isn't formal? No, Axel said, leaning in, his warm mouth a whisper against Thomas's lips. It's much more animalistic than that. The rumble of the engine started up again, stronger this time, louder, harder, and Thomas and Axel were pushed hard against the desk by a sudden force that almost felt as if they'd been pushed. Axel had to reach out with his hand, catching the both of them by grabbing onto the desk before his weight crushed Thomas against it. What's happening? Thomas asked, almost shouting over the noise. Wormhole jump. This'll take a few minutes. You should hold on to me. Thomas did just that. He threw his arms around Axel's neck and was shocked when the other man pulled him down and around to the floor. There was a small rug there. Thomas didn't understand how every single item in the captain's quarters wasn't flying all over the place, unless everything was being held down with magnets and more glue. But it was just him and Axel on the floor, on a surprisingly soft rug, and the surface beneath Thomas's back and butt still vibrated, but now it felt strangely good, especially when Axel settled himself between Thomas's legs and pushed against him, thrusting their pelvises together. Thomas moaned. God, that felt good. The vibrations beneath his body and the pleasure of the friction he was getting through his clothes. He was going to combust into fire. So hot. He was burning up, and he needed to get these clothes off his body. Thomas pushed against Axel's chest, trying to put some space between their bodies. Axel moved, thankfully. They didn't always move whenever Thomas gave one of those hints. The captain noted what Thomas was doing, and he quickly did the same, taking and removing his clothes, first with his vest, unbuckling the harness for his pistol at his hip, and tossing that away too. God, I can't believe I found you, Axel said, the biggest, widest smile on his face as he leaned in and crushed their mouths together. It felt good. So warm and so good. The vibration of the ship, coupled with the intensity of that kiss, and the constant thrust of their cocks together, still clothed despite their efforts to get out of their pants. It was too much, and Thomas broke the golden rule. He came first, hard and sweet, spasming and moaning. He didn't care, either, especially when he felt the hard moan Axel let out against his mouth, and the way the dragon's captain's body tensed. Then, just as suddenly, Axel pulled away from him, jumping to his feet, nearly falling over thanks to the constant pressure that was in the cabin. But he didn't fall over. Thomas couldn't so much as think about getting to his feet when he was still holding onto the floor. But he was still able to watch as Axel, with a roar that was almost louder than the constant thrum of the engine, ripped his clothes right from his body, chest expanding, scales forming, golden brown in colour, almost the same shade as his hair. And only when Thomas realised what he was looking at did it occur to him how much trouble he was in. Axel was shifting. He was turning into a dragon right in front of him. Chapter 3. When Axel's body stretched and elongated in some places, his scales finally able to breathe when they were out, he let out a long, relieved sigh. That felt so much better. Luckily, he hadn't gone into his full size. He could make himself bigger, a lot bigger, big enough to take up almost all the space in the mess hall. As he wasn't much larger than a tiger shifter. They didn't have differing sizes, they only had one size. Axel shook himself out, stretching his wings as much as he was able to get away with in his quarters, with a satisfied groan of approval. That felt incredibly good. He hadn't made a proper claim, but the dragon was satisfied, at least for now, with a little dry humping and hard kissing. Axel couldn't wait to carve the mating symbol on his chest. That was going to be amazing. And they were still in the middle of the jump. The engine was humming, and he still felt and heard the groaning of metal in the ship as he travelled through the wormhole. Sometimes it was like being inside of a soda can that was constantly being squeezed just a little too much. Axel looked down at his mate and noted the way Thomas was staring up at him with wide eyes on his fancy rug. The noises of the ship around him? That could be freaking him out. No, that was a little dumb. Obviously the thing that was bothering him most was that Axel had just ripped his clothes off and transformed into a dragon shape in front of his mate. Axel felt himself purring a little. Even with an enormous lizard, most people couldn't help but allow themselves to be lulled by the sound of a pleasing purr. "You all right?" he asked, making sure his voice was just high enough to be heard over the intense humming noises and vibrations around them, but not loud enough that it seemed as if they were shouting. Thomas's eyes widened, as if he hadn't expected Axel to be able to speak while he was in this form. He nodded. Fine. Did that hurt?" Axel grinned, but made sure not to show his teeth when he did. "Not at all. Want to touch it?" He spread his wings out to his mate, the invitation evident. Thomas pushed himself into a sitting position, but even that he had trouble keeping balance with. For the duration of wormhole trips, all crew were to be strapped into their seats. There were 2 seats with seat belts here that he would put his mate in just a moment, but for now, for this, he wanted his lover to be able to be explored. Thomas reached his hand out, appeared as if he was about to fall over, but Axel caught him with a wing. It was cute, seeing the way Thomas's eyes flew wide enough that Axel could see all the whites around them. "All right?" Axel asked. Yeah," Thomas said, trying to pull back, but he still needed a little help. Axel kept his mate propped up with a wing, allowing his lover to slide his hands over the leathery middle, the bones that held it together, and the single spike at the end. Axel loved watching his mate explore his body. It really was a sight to behold. He lost himself in it. It was good, and he was content. There was no mistake, this was the real thing, and so long as he got to keep his mate close like this, he would always be happy. He was a little too happy, because he didn't hear what Thomas said at first. "What was that?" Thomas swallowed, and more colour climbed his neck. I said, I'm sorry I came first." Axel blinked, then he smiled, and it was such a wide and happy thing that he really couldn't help but show off his teeth. "You don't have to be sorry for something like that." "Why would you think you had to be sorry for that?" Thomas kept his eyes down on Axel's wing and shook his head. "I don't know." Axel frowned. He did know. There was something to this. Well, his mate was either a petty thief or on the run for some other reason, but either way, Axel knew there were secrets. He would figure them out in due time. For now, he wanted to enjoy what was his. "If I said you were mine, and that I was going to keep you forever, and you would keep me, what would you say?" Axel wasn't entirely sure what he expected from that question, but a look of horror was most definitely not it. Ryan watched the Big Alpha with an intense curiosity he'd never allowed himself to feel before, or at least, never allowed himself to show on the outside. Did all dragons have such short hair? Ryan hadn't seen too many people on the ship since it had taken off, even after that horrible humming noise had stopped, and he was finally able to stand up straight without fear of being knocked over. But everyone he did see either had short hair, or it was all shaved entirely off. The Shark Masters tended to have longer hair, even the guards. Ammond had the nicest shade of black hair Ryan had ever seen in his life. He swore it turned blue in the light sometimes. It was wonderful, and he allowed himself to stare at it, even while Ammond meanly barked into the comm on his wrist. He couldn't be talking to the captain like that, but he was definitely speaking to whoever was currently flying the ship. Apparently he thought the flight through the wormhole was a little on the rough side. Ryan couldn't stop staring at him. He couldn't explain why, but it was as if there was an aura around him that made the mean expression look beautiful. The others shivered and quivered fearfully in the corner they'd been given in the storage area, some asking where Thomas had been taken to, speculating all kinds of horrible fates. But Ryan was swept up in the vision before him. It felt like coming home, a familiar feeling that he'd been looking for his whole life. Which was why when the large dragon growled and snapped his head around to glare at him, Ryan was completely thrown off. "Stop staring at me!" Ryan tensed. He looked back behind him stupidly, as if to make sure he wasn't the only one causing offence. He definitely was, as the others all made sure to look away, and appear as small and harmless as they possibly could, leaving Ryan hanging in the wind. "I said something to you. Answer when you're spoken to, or I'll throw you out an airlock." Ryan looked back at the bigger man, stunned. "Would you really do that?" Ammon growled at him. "Don't test me." That was by far a threat set in stone. Ryan had heard many of them,
and had seen many others carried out, regardless of innocence or the begging on the part of those who were being punished. All the same, he didn't think Ammon would do such a thing to him. Ryan thought himself safe. Ammon was an angry alpha, that much was certain, and Ryan felt the whispers of a challenge speaking sweetly into his ear, along with the desire to get closer to what he wanted. The big double doors hissed and spread apart just then, and the captain, who had left with Thomas, came marching back inside. "Turn round, we're going back." The others were silent, not daring to even breathe when they heard those words. Ryan couldn't believe it either. Back? No, they just left. They just got out of the wormhole and were in another solar system. They couldn't go back. Thomas followed the captain close behind, grabbing at his arms, desperation in his eyes and face. "No, please, don't send us back." "I'm not sending you back, I'm sending them back," the captain snapped. "Ammon, make sure they don't go anywhere." Ammon shrugged and reached for his weapons. "Fine by me. That one stares a lot." Ryan nearly jumped, even though Ammon didn't pull his pistol out of the holster. "You can't shoot that in here," Ryan said desperately. "What if you put a hole in the side of the ship?" Ammon smiled at him. "You don't know your guns if you think this will penetrate the walls of the ship. It will, however, penetrate living tissue, so do us all a favor and keep your pretty mouth shut." Ryan shut his mouth. Thomas was still pleading with the captain, even as he lifted his wrist and spoke into his comm. "When can we expect another wormhole to open up? We need to make a trip back." "Don't do this, Axel. Please don't do this." A voice on the other end answered him. "You want me to ask them when they're planning on opening another illegal highway to the Pegasus system?" The captain shut his eyes. "Yes, idiot, that's exactly what I'm asking." Made sense that the smugglers would use an unauthorized space highway to get to and from systems where their buyers lived. It wouldn't always be open, which meant there was time to get the captain to change his mind. "Please don't send us back, they will kill us." Ammon lifted a brow. "What? You a bunch of escaped slaves or something?" Ryan didn't answer that, and neither did the frightened men behind him. The captain, however, did. "That's exactly what they are. The sharks will be on our tails soon enough if we don't get rid of them." "Could just get rid of them right now," Ammon suggested. This time Ryan wasn't so sure the other man wouldn't really hurt him, not with that look on his face. "No, they'll want their property back," the captain said, "and they'll want to punish us for taking what was theirs." "We didn't take shit, they came to us," Ammon muttered, staring at Ryan with a strange look. "You know they won't care about that." "Don't do this," Thomas shouted. "We're trying to get away from them. Just take us to Earth and you'll be fine. You'll never see or hear from us ever again." "Earth's still a month away," the captain replied. "Anything could happen in that time, and I said I wasn't leaving you behind." Thomas pushed himself away from the captain, disgust in his eyes and hatred. "You think I'd stay with you and give up my friends? Fuck you! I won't stay with someone like you." Ryan couldn't believe he was watching this. His eyes were wide on the exchange. No one ever spoke that way to their betters. If Ryan and the others weren't as free as they'd thought they were just a moment ago, then that meant their lives were very much still in danger. They couldn't mouth off. They couldn't fight for themselves. They were still slaves, and the captain was going to give them back to their masters for punishment. Fuck, oh fuck, that was not good. Ryan felt cold all over. He didn't know what to do. That familiar feeling of being trapped. Yeah, that was the word. He felt trapped, unable to move or breathe. Usually the cold was fine with him, but this was paralyzing, terrifying. "Please, don't send us back," Ryan begged. "We can be useful to you. You said you wanted us to work on the ship. We can do that for you." The captain shook his head, returning his attention to Thomas. He tried speaking softly to him, but Thomas pushed away from him. "Fuck you. Fuck you. You're a liar. If that was true, you wouldn't be trying to send me and my friends back to slavery and murder. You're a prick. You were supposed to be the legendary captain of the shark fin smuggling ship. For God's sake, Axel, how much do these people know about us? Ammon turned to the others. Behind him, Ryan felt Tanner's hand slide into his own, and it was trembling. Ryan looked Ammon right in the eyes. He didn't dare turn away. You don't hide as well as you think you do. Of course there are stories. They don't know anything, just stories servants pass on to each other, and servants don't talk to their masters. You mean slaves? Thomas said, still glaring, his fist clenched. You're saying the stories aren't true? That you don't fight against pirates and sharks? That you haven't rescued other slaves before? Ammon chuckled, shaking his head. This is too much. Ryan's heart sank. A dismissal like that could only mean that they were wrong. The captain shook his head. What you heard are stories. We don't do the things we do because we're heroes. We do them because it pays good money to smuggle goods and steal from pirates and shark ships. Everything else is probably exaggerated, mostly by us to make people scared of us. For the first time since boarding the ship, Ryan realized where he was. He wasn't in a ship meant to take him to his freedom, and he wasn't surrounded by good men who fought for justice either. He was in a smuggler's ship, surrounded by rogues. The look on Thomas's face told Ryan how his friend had just realized the same thing. Thomas rubbed his hand over his mouth. The captain reached for his hand, grabbing it and holding on tight even when Thomas tried to pull away. I said I wouldn't let them take you, and I meant it. You're my mate now. I won't let any harm come to you, I promise. Thomas punched the captain on the face. It was so unexpected and sudden that Ryan, along with everyone else, jumped. Some made noises of shock. Ammon didn't move, didn't draw his weapon, didn't so much as twitch. It was as if the entire thing had left him more bored than before. The captain pulled back and wiped under his nose. A touch of blood came back. If you send them back, I'm going with them, he threatened. Ryan couldn't believe it. He shook his head. Don't throw yourself on the sword for us. Thomas looked at him. So did the captain. Tanner clenched Ryan's hand tighter, but this needed to be said. If he wants to keep one of us, then fine, let it be you. At least one of us will get away. What sort of slaves were you anyway? Ammon asked. Ryan glared at the man, feeling a sort of animosity towards him for the first time. Pleasure slaves. Ryan didn't expect his answer to have any effect, which was why it shocked him so much when it did. Ammon's deep black eyes flew wide, and he looked back at the captain, who was suddenly rubbing the bridge between his eyes. You know this? No, I didn't know, the captain said. I just came here when Thomas told me. Ammon glared at the captain. We can't send them back. Ryan was stunned. Really? That was his response? He didn't want to send them back? We don't have a choice, the captain muttered. You didn't hear who they were slaves for. All right, who? Ammon asked. The Emperor Shark? Close. His head general, Wren. It was easy to see from the sagging of Ammon's shoulders that this was not a good thing. The captain continued. Even if he does not come personally, he will send others. Other sharks, whether they be pirates themselves, smugglers, guards, it doesn't matter. He'll send them. Then just get us to Earth, Thomas insisted. We're in the blue solar system anyway. They can't take us back. Slavery's outlawed here. You need to be on a planet for that to matter to anyone other than planetary officials, the captain said. We're basically in open waters without hardly any chance of coming across help should we be attacked. Well, if it's that hard for us to find anyone else, why are you giving up on us? And don't tell me you won't give me up because that's bullshit. You're an asshole. You're a prick. Nothing like I thought you would actually be. Sorry to disappoint you. Not all legends are romantic, the captain deadpanned.
It seemed to be that uncaring drone of a tone that got to Thomas the most. His shoulders shook with a rage that no servant or slave should ever be allowed to show to their master. The possibility of being buried alive or stoned to death as punishment was too great, and those were not good ways to go in any universe. Thomas kept glaring at the captain. His eyes, they shone with tears. That made Ryan frown. Why would he be crying? What was going on here? This made no sense because Thomas and the captain had just met each other. There was no reason for Thomas to cry. Well, it could have been the fact that the captain was callously talking about sending them back to their lives of slavery and misery, but this felt different. This felt like a heartbreak of a different kind, and Ryan had no idea why his friend would feel an emotion like this. Thomas walked away from the captain. Shockingly, the captain's eyes widened. He reached out as if to stop Thomas from leaving his side, but then stopped himself. Thomas walked over to their group. He and Ryan locked eyes for a moment, and Ryan wished with everything he had that he knew what was going on. Why he felt such a terrible heartbreak, and why it didn't entirely feel like it was just because they had failed. Ryan looked up at Ammond, and he fell back a step at the sight of a strangely pale Alpha. This man was a dragon, a warrior, and a smuggler who did many dangerous things. Yet even with those broad shoulders and height, he appeared small, as he promptly followed his captain out of the storage area. When the doors were closed and they were locked in, everyone huddled around each other for warmth and comfort. Thomas shed tears, and so did many others, including Ryan, now that they were faced with the possibility that they might be going back.